Today's teaching moment is a little more serious. I'm sharing with you A Public Apology to the Siksika Nation by A. Bronson, and it includes an essay by Ben Miller. They write about Bronson's great-great-grandfather, Reverend John William Timms, who was a missionary to the Siksika Nation in the late 1800s. Reverend Timms was an Anglican, but when it comes to our history of colonialism, all the churches were the same. Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, Anglican, we were all engaged in the same activities. I share this because stories like Reverend Tim's is important for our work towards reconciliation. We need to hear what the history was, what the harm was, before healing can happen. When you commit atrocities, please do so with a smile. That's my paraphrase of a critique leveled from an RCMP commissioner against Reverend John W. Timms in 1895. Reverend Timms was doing his part in settler colonialism and the destruction of indigenous culture, which the government was quite pleased with, if it wasn't for the fact that, quote, he has undoubtedly a pugnacious and I might say an offensive manner which undoubtedly jars the Indians' feelings. So, carry on with the eradication of their culture, but there's no need to be hurting anyone's feelings over it. Reverend J.W. Timms was a Christian missionary sent out to the Siksika Nation outside of Calgary. He set up a system of boarding schools, built a church, and tried to convert Indigenous peoples not just to Christianity, but to a Western agricultural lifestyle that was viewed as a key step in assimilating Indigenous communities. After several children died in the school, there was a rebellion, and Reverend Tim was run out of town. The fault was placed on Reverend Timms for his callous methods and his grumpy disposition, as if to imply that everything he did would have been fine if he was just nicer about it. And that niceness is a key part to understanding how Canada engaged in genocide. Genocide is a strong word, but remember, that's the conclusion of the Truth and Reconciliation reports. We participated in genocide, but we hid it under a sense of Canadian niceness. Here's an example from Alberta. White settlers hunted out the buffalo for sport, leaving thousands of Indigenous people to starve. Then missionaries like Reverend Timms comes in, sees sick and starving First Nations, and concludes that they just need to learn how to farm, and he starts up boarding schools to teach them. A lot of the settlers thought that they were being nice, without recognizing the system of harm that they were complicit in. Except for Reverend Timms, he wasn't nice. He was simply an unpleasant man, and that unpleasantness threatened to overturn the whole colonial project there. Both the Siksika Nation and the government Indian agents wanted Reverend Timms out of the area. The schools Reverend Timms founded continued, but managed by more agreeable, nicer people. The same harm continued, but masked by folks that smiled more. And in that way, this genocide would keep going. All the while, the settlers involved are convinced that they're doing the nice and kind thing. There are people around Reverend Timms who fought against him, who said that he went too far. They lobbied for better treatment of Siksika people, but none questioned the system that oppressed them. None called for the end of residential schools themselves, just a change in leadership. And this is the warning for us today. Could we be guilty of the same thing? We can't just do charity. We can't just give money at problems without also doing justice. We need to help those who are oppressed while also questioning the structures that oppress them. As Desmond Tutu says, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. Without having that bigger awareness, there's a risk that we too could be participating in atrocity and doing so with a smile. As a denomination, we are committed to seeking ways of healing and reconciliation with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. It means sharing stories like this and educating ourselves about the church's role in colonialism. It's not easy. And I'm sorry that this teaching moment isn't more fun, but it is important. And I thank you for opening your hearts to this sort of reflection. Please continue to pray for the relationship between the church and Indigenous peoples.